And today I'm going to be looking at a selection of case studies that emerged in the 90s in the cities of Belgrade, Sarajevo, and Pristina. And I'm going to be focusing on how certain artists responded to this transitional period of violence, of conflict, political instability, and economic misery. So this work that I'm showing behind me will be familiar to many of you in the audience today. It is, of course, Marina Abramovic's now famous Balkan Baroque, first performed at the Venice Biennial in 1997. In this photograph, the artist is shown scrubbing the last remnants and residues of meat and blood from over 1,500 cow bones with a metal brush and soap, which she did for 6 hours a day over 4 consecutive days. Behind her, a video installation shaped as a triptych played a story about the creation of wolf rats in the Balkans, animals that, when placed under unbearable conditions, begin to destroy each other. When Abramović first performed Balkan Baroque, there was still little of a clear understanding as to what had led to Yugoslavia's violent collapse. While international security organizations had declared the conflict as inevitable, a result of partition and nationalism endemic to the Balkans, audiences in Western Europe and America largely preferred the argument that Yugoslavia's demise was an eruption of ethnic hatreds between South Slavic nations. Rarely was it seen as part of the more widespread phenomenon of political disintegration involving a collapse in governmental authority and social norms, which rapidly escalated into claims over sovereignty itself. And even less frequently was it seen through kind of international factors or as not one but several conflicts which evolved over time and required different actions to prevent its descent into territorial war and ethnic violence, neither of which were inevitable. But contrary to what we might assume, this Balkan metamorphosis did not just strictly occur through ideas circulating in Western Europe and America at the time. Instead, this shift of identification emerged in Yugoslavia itself, and more specifically, Milosevic's Serbia. In 1993, for example, Belgrade's Museum of Contemporary Art, the museum's director was forcibly removed from his position and replaced with a new board of members who promoted the ideology of the Serbian national program. Once a stronghold for neo-avant-garde practices in Yugoslavia, the museum inaugurated its new orientation with an exhibition called Balkan Sources in 1993. Evading any references to existing narratives on contemporary art in Yugoslavia, the exhibition sought to give a historical overview of Serbian art in the 20th century. Figurative paintings were used to illustrate topics that had received the most coverage in Serbia, including, in the words of art historian Branislav Dimitrijević, Orthodox Christianity, national myths in the form of erotic and pornographic cliches, and ethnic symbolism. When considering Serbian art in the 1990s, I think that it's important to bear in mind such cultural manifestations, because they demonstrate the extent to which the regime and its ardent supporters successfully eliminated all meaningful alternatives to itself, including in the art world and the cultural sphere. On assuming the role of the Republic's president in 1990, Slobodan Milosevic oversaw Serbia's transition into a semi-authoritarian state, in which political opposition was hampered, independent media silenced, and competitive elections stolen. It was this oppressive climate, together with the lack of a political opposition powerful enough to resist the military forces of the Serbian Socialist Party, that led to a major depoliticization of art at the time. But in spite of this all-encompassing consolidation of political control, in Belgrade there were some attempts to reclaim the streets as an area for free thought. In the same year that the Museum of Contemporary Art exhumed its Balkan Sources, a newly established art collective called Led Art, or Ice Art, made a striking entrance onto the city's countercultural scene. On an evening in May 1993, the group parked a giant refrigerated truck outside of Belgrade's youth house, or Dom Omladine. The seemingly inconspicuous vehicle was transformed into an exhibition space. Its dark and cavernous trailer, framed by battered sheets of corrugated steel, housing a series of objects cast in large melting blocks of ice. Before entering the space, visitors were handed military coats to keep them warm. Inside, they were greeted by items which included an old Yugoslav flag perched in a corner and stuck in a giant barrel of lard. Unlike the other objects on display, the fatty and viscous substance refused to solidify under the chilling temperatures. A work by the pioneering conceptual and action artist Draša Todosijević, God se liebt die Serben, or God loves the Serbs, was an explicit reference to the fascist dimensions of Serbian nationalism. Founded by the visual artist Nikola Jafo, lead art saw the metaphors of freezing and hibernation as central to Serbian cultural life. Their first action addressed the absolute absurdity of living a seemingly normal everyday life in Belgrade when a war was raging only a few hundred kilometers away in Bosnia. Handing visitors army coats at the truck's entrance, the action implied that everyone, no matter how uninvolved, were implicated in the wars. At the same time, the action called for forms of self-preservation at a time which the group understood as Serbia's cultural, political, and ethical ice age. After their founding action, ice continued to be a material incorporated into numerous sculptures, installations, and performances created by the group's members, and freezing a gesture that aimed to turn the streets into spaces of political cleansing. As the group declared in a manifesto from 1993, refusing to participate in destruction, slaughter, plunder, silence, we are moving out of conventional spaces. Rejecting the conformist way of thought and trodden path, we are living and creating without a purpose. We are finding a new way, a way in between. Amongst other initiatives in Belgrade, lead art organized a parallel life and formed a segment of the anti-war civic scene of the other Serbia. This scene emerged in a climate of sanctions, systemic crisis, and political transformation, the absurdities of which I think were made quite clear in the Žilnik film that we watched yesterday. But often this art scene is understood as one that was ultimately escapist and politically disengaged, and this assessment might seem reasonable enough. But at the same time, initiatives like lead art resisted an oppressive political climate in which the Socialist Party of Serbia had systematically dismantled all alternative ideas in the fields of culture, politics, and the media. Ideas that would have offered individuals the means to unite in a manner distinct from and threatening to the regime. In that respect, though not always overtly anti-regime, they were ostensibly politicized. But few had a substantial impact beyond their immediate surroundings and audiences, because as the world looked on in shock as Milosevic aided Bosnia's breakaway Serbs and fueled ethnic conflict, little attention was paid to the Serbian leadership's assault on the republic's system of political and cultural institutions. And for many, it was these misunderstandings that allowed Western governments to consciously not support domestic alternatives to Milosevic, leaving a committed but nevertheless imperfect political opposition to remain unsupported throughout most of the 1990s. Meanwhile, as war raged in neighboring Bosnia and Herzegovina, the international and regional organizations of collective security and their member states failed to prevent the ensuing violence, debating amongst themselves whether it was a civil war or a war of external aggressions. As one Western diplomat put it at the time in a simple but striking indictment, the Europe in Maastricht did not hear the calls for help from the Europe in Sarajevo. But there was one intellectual who famously attempted to bridge the gap between these two seemingly distant and disconnected Europes. Susan Sontag heard the calls for help from Sarajevo in July 1993, came to the besieged city to stage a production of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, and I believe this was actually funded by the Open Society, interestingly. Sontag's trip stemmed from her determination to assemble an international community advocating international intervention, which was in turn based on her appreciation of Bosnia's secular multiculturalism, though the historical specificities of this multiculturalism and what it could and should mean for Europe were rarely delved into. Yet while for Sontag, the staging of a play in Sarajevo signaled an expression of normality, the impracticality of the project was by no means a novelty. It was instead one of many that took place over the first year in the midst of the siege, including the Witnesses of Existence exhibition that took place over the first year of the siege in the destroyed Obala theatre space. And here I'm showing you the postcard for the exhibition. And I'm going to focus on one particular exhibition as part of this year-long series, which is this. This is a photograph of the exhibition installed by the influential Bosnian painter Edo Numankadić on the 3rd of February 1993. It is the physical traces of a performance he did together with his wife, for which they bought their kitchen table from their apartment, together with paintings he had recently made and some personal belongings, and installed them in the ruins and debris of the Obala space. And I find it interesting because the contents on display not only evidence the political situation at the time, but also often the shallow understanding of Sarajevo as this multicultural paradise that was favored by Western media outlets. Some of the items, such as the box of tuna with noodles, speak to the inadequate response of the international community, which reacted to the daily shelling of civilians in Sarajevo with delayed convoys of humanitarian aid. Others speak subtly to everyday life in the besieged city at a time when Sarajevo had only a black market economy, such as the stale bread or the empty packet of cigarettes. And then there's also this book by Radovan Ivsic, a Croatian poet and writer who spent his life resisting both right and left-wing totalitarianism. But I think it's also interesting to consider the kind of work of an artist like this in relation to something like this that was happening. This happened in the year before, where the renowned art collective Irvin from Ljubljana moved eastwards and expanded its networks of communication and exchange with the former Eastern Bloc in Russia. I think it speaks to the kind of regional dynamics of cultural production in Yugoslavia, because very often we seem to understand it as this kind of conceptual performance art scene, but really how might an analysis, a comparative analysis between this alternative art scene, this highly sophisticated alternative art scene that emerged in Ljubljana in the 1980s, kind of addressing the antagonisms at the core of Yugoslavia's crisis, relate to the art scene in Sarajevo in the 1980s. And this is the cover for the Witnesses of Existence catalogue, which was really a feat of creative resourcefulness and improvisation in the face of, and defiance in the face of systematic destruction. The cover itself was printed as a silkscreen in the Academy of Fine Arts in a limited run, and the pages were themselves printed in the offices of the daily newspaper Oslobođenje. But cultural initiatives like Witnesses of Existence resisted the siege by sustaining a strong, dignified identity in the face of systematic destruction. Though seemingly marginal in their reach and impact, by standing their own ground against Western Europe and America, these initiatives refused to be assimilated through the game of Western compassion. And in doing so, they pointed to the mutually cynical relationship between a passive international community and the opportunistic nationalist elites in fueling Yugoslavia's collapse, anticipating the key means of depoliticizing the rebuilding of society in Bosnia. Under the US-brokered Dayton Agreement of 1995, which ended the war, the country was divided into two entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska, designed as a power-sharing mechanism between three constituent peoples, Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. Dayton placed Bosnia under international regulation and supervision. It reproduced wartime ethnic cleavages in the post-war period, segregating combatant groups into self-governing territories that would undermine the central government, ensure the successive electoral victories, and ensure the successive electoral victories of ultranationalists. And by privileging national identity, Dayton has, for many, been seen as a way of preventing citizens from acting together politically and becoming self-determining subjects. Aware of the politics that governed the Dayton settlement, the notorious Slovenian punk group, the Laibach, came to Sarajevo to play 2 concerts at the National Theatre. On the 21st and 22nd of November 1995, just days after the signing of the Dayton Agreement, NSK, the art collective, also launched their embassy project in the National Theatre, distributing NSK passports for free of charge to Sarajevo citizens, insisting that, and this is the passport and the postcard for the event, insisting that Sarajevo did not need a humanitarian concert. At the National Theatre, Laibach performed songs from their recently released NATO album, which condemned selective Western military involvement in the former Yugoslavia and its escalation in the name of humanitarian and democratic intervention. The album's sleeve even included an obituary for NATO as an alliance designed to prevent aggression or repel it. And the CD's penultimate tracks, lyrics, lamented the global destruction of territory and diplomacy through the wars during the 1990s, and included an apocalyptic and perhaps even prognostic forecast that in the year 1999, war will destroy the last skyline. And in some ways, they did. As the wars in Croatia and Bosnia were drawing to a close after 1995, the situation in Kosovo was deteriorating. Already in 1989, Milosevic deprived Kosovo of its constitutional autonomy and placed it under martial law. This process began with the revival of the myth of the Kosovo battle on the occasion of the 600th anniversary at Gazimenstan, just outside of Pristina in 1989, and continued throughout the 1990s, with over 130,000 Albanians being removed from institutional positions. But in spite of repressive circumstances, vital forms of self-organization in politics, education, healthcare, and culture enabled Kosovo Albanians to construct a parallel society, and these models even extended to the field of art. Unsurprisingly, the Kosovo alternative art scene developed in complete isolation to its Serbian counterpart. Because of the state of emergency forcibly imposed on Kosovo and the subsequent creation of alternative social, political, and cultural systems, Albanian artists refused to exhibit their work in Serbia, nor were there many opportunities to do so. But in 1997, as Milosevic launched the counterinsurgency crackdown in Kosovo and the Serbian government began to prepare for a campaign of ethnic cleansing of Kosovo's Albanian population, one of Belgrade's only state-independent cultural institutions, the Center for Cultural Decontamination, showcased the work of Kosovo's emerging artists in an exhibition called Perte. Belgrade's Center for Cultural Decontamination was established in 1995 with a self-declared purpose of challenging the atmosphere that has been contaminated by orchestrated nationalism, hatred, and destruction. In the case of Perte, named after the Albanian word for above, across the, besides, or at the other side, showing the work of young Albanian artists from Kosovo in Belgrade was both a contamination in the sense that it spotlighted the work of individuals widely believed to be the enemies of the Serbian nation, and a decontamination aiming to counter the rewriting of history by the nationalist elites of Yugoslavia's newly formed nation-states. In the words of one of the exhibitors, Sokol Bekiri, Perte was intended to demonstrate in Belgrade of all places that despite everything that was happening there, artists were still working in Pristina and trying to behave responsibly, first of all towards their art and towards others, towards part of Belgrade, which did not agree with the essentially primitive and destructive policy of Milosevic. And this is one work by Mehmet Beluli, Flutron, or Fly Fly, which is colloquially termed ethno-bombs, and was a kind of critique of this exploitation of ethnicity and claims of nationalisms to fight with all means for their exclusive national rights. And again, I think looking at these kinds of works, it's interesting to think about the kind of regional dynamics. I mean, up until the 1980s in Pristina, academicism was still very much present in comparison to the cities of Belgrade, Ljubljana, and Zagreb, where, how much? One more, okay. So I'm getting to my conclusion. So for all those involved in the organization of PERTE, behaving responsibly meant refusing to simply become representatives of their nations and refusing the false promises of national homogeneity. With PERTE, there was no attempt to disguise or redress the potential difference implied in the work shown. Instead, the exhibition was intended to introduce Belgrade audiences to an unknown artistic community in Kosovo and to foster common ground between two warring peoples. Because of this, the scale and the visibility of the venue, it received no criticism in Belgrade. But in Pristina, its exhibitors were branded as traitors in local newspapers by professors in the art academy. Though a seemingly irrelevant detail, this criticism spotlights how nationalism had gripped much of the post-Yugoslav space. It shows that though quantitative differences in the region's nationalisms were significant, Serbian aggression was by far the strongest and set off the war. They were, as Alan Badiou argued, not significant enough to justify a qualitative difference between the nationalism of the Serbs and the others. This is why Badiou concluded with reference to the Yugoslav wars that the people of the region, regardless of their ethnicity or nationality, should, quote, fight hard and long against all nationalisms. It is time to restore luster to the principles that governed the classic epoch of national liberation. It is only by relying on its own strengths that a people can regulate its own affairs by political means, and in this way, small peoples will be able to act independently of the great powers. Of course, Badiou's analysis glazes over the complex questions of self-determination, minority rights, and the balance between large and small nation-states in the Yugoslav context. It carries the risk of depoliticizing the significance of the Serb aggression. And seen through the worrisome developments that have taken hold in the region over the last year, it seems pretty idealistic. But I think that his reflection nevertheless offered one important insight into the fate of the post-Yugoslav space at the end of the decade, that of the role of international supervision and institutions. Because when NATO finally intervened in Bosnia and later in Kosovo and Serbia, it was a tragic end to an even more tragic experience as a whole. NATO did not topple a proud regime defending its people. It was in fact fighting a force that grew out of the compromises and inconsistencies of Western policies. But for Western Europe and America, the year 2000 marked a peak in its post-Cold War self-confidence. At this time, there was a strong belief that what would happen in the Balkans would be dependent on the will of Brussels and Washington to engage with the region. In line with this deeply entrenched image of the Balkans as a region in urgent need of supervision, a new series of democratizing processes were brought in, along with new exclusion mechanisms through the EU accession process. At precisely the same time, a new Balkan art was born, and the art production of the 1990s was misplaced and swept aside in favor of an emotionally charged account of life in a land of historic uncertainties. Today, while there are a whole new series of politically correct terms for the geographic region that was formerly Yugoslavia, the Balkans continues to be a shorthand for nationalist fragmentation, economic precariousness, and social backwardness. And as long as these shorthand stands, the region's art will be expected to be nothing short of Balkan Baroque. Thank you.